Hello, my name is Robert Emmett Hernan. I'm head of BlueStacks Productions, Inc., publisher of Irish Environment, an online magazine for environmental matters on the island of Ireland. We're here today in another of our series of conversations on environmental issues. I'm very pleased today to welcome Dr. John Berry from Queen's University Belfast. You're very welcome, John.
Thank you.
John is the reader of in the School of Politics, International Studies and Philosophy. He's director of Center for Sustainability and Environmental Governance. He's the associate director for the Institute for a Sustainable World. He's co-editor of Environmental Politics, and he's co-editor of Ecopolitics Online. I think, John, it's fair to say that you've thought about and worked quite a bit on sustainable development.
Indeed, I have, Bob.
I wonder if it's an elusive term in many ways. I wonder if you could give the audience as concrete, specific, real a sense of what that term means.
Well, the simplest definition of sustainable development is one planet living. In other words, we try and create decent lives for as many people as possible for as long as possible while living within the broad ecological and energy parameters of the planet. That's one simple definition, one planet living. Mm-hmm. A second one, which I'm rather more fond of when I'm talking in a more public, less academic sense, is that it simply means good quality of life for all. Because there are very technical definitions of sustainable development in terms of flows of energy and material, triple bottom line of the social, economic and environmental dimensions of our lives. But I think really sustainable development is about the choice to live a different type of life, which means a different economy, a different metabolism and relationship between ourselves and the place we live in and the energy and resources that we need. So one planet living and quality of life, perhaps the simplest way of describing what sustainable development actually is.
Now, how does it interplay with economic development? Because that's the tension within sustainable development and people's response to it. I mean, Frank MacDonald from the Irish Times had infamously described the Republic of Ireland political administration in the 80s and 90s for whom sustainable development meant development that must be sustained.
Yes.
And there is that element. So how do you deal with those two competing interests?
Yes, I mean there's a fundamental tension, if you like, in some understanding of sustainable development. It has to be said as well that sustainability is much like democracy and justice and equality. A lot of people would agree with them, but then they all differ on how or what they actually mean by that. Mm-hmm. For me, I'm on the more radical for some people's views. For me, it's more scientifically informed, and essentially is that sustainable development is not compatible with orthodox economic growth as we've understood it for the past 50 years, particularly in the post-war era. That does not mean we're going back to the Stone Age or some sort of pre-modern view or way of life. It simply means we've got to be smarter, using less energy, less resources. But that does mean that we're going to have to, in one way, to put it very simply, start thinking about quality of life in terms of free time and decent jobs, as opposed to endless economic growth, particularly foreign direct investment and globalization. This I would share with other authors and thinkers such as Tim Jackson in America, who wrote a very well-received report last year, and there was a book called Prosperity Without Progress, that actually we need to break the link between economic growth as we conventionally understood it and all that goes with it, increasing energy use, increasing resource use, and actually start looking at quality of life, because economic growth at the end of the day is only meaningful if it's about enhancing quality of life. So why not go for quality of life directly?
John, would you go and say that sustainable development would trump economic development if they came in conflict? Or is that too simplistic a dichotomy?
But I think you picked up on the essential issue there, which is the difference between development and growth. Mm-hmm. Things can develop without growing. And part of the problem with our current model of economic growth is that, to put it rather bluntly, it's the ideology of the cancer cell, mm-hmm. which essentially growth for its own sake. Mm-hmm. How much has growth in the last 20 or 30 years actually contributed to human well-being? I mean, there are well-established models and statistics, whether it's Juliet Shore in America or the work of Tim Jackson and others in the UK, to demonstrate what's essentially called the crocodile graph. If you can imagine over time, the graph going up is GDP, GNP, whichever measure you want to use, and on the bottom here is reported levels of social well-being. Mm-hmm. And essentially you have this phenomenon. that over the last 30 or 40 years, while GDP has gone up, yes, we've had our downs and we're in a current downward spiral now, that actually reported levels of well-being haven't been actually increasing. So we've had what's been called a social recession. So really it raises fundamental questions, the type of model of development we want. Can we find an economics of sustainability which enhances quality of life, gives decent jobs to people, at the same time making sure that everybody has all the food, energy and so on that they need?
Do you see that evolving within the Northern Ireland administration, that kind of sensitivity to sustainable development as you see it and as you'd like it to happen?
Sadly not. I mean, a resounding no. If I was grading the end of term paper of the executive on this topic, there'd be a resounding fail. They need to do a hell of a lot better in terms of understanding fundamentally what sustainability is. I mean, sadly, the executive is walking into the future looking backwards and not seeing that Northern Ireland stands in a wonderful position to be able to grasp some of the opportunities for sustainable development in terms of the energy resources we have, the engineering skills that we have here in abundance. But unfortunately the executive is still like many administrations around the world, so it's no different than the UK or indeed the Republic of Ireland or the States, and even in looking at a fairly orthodox model of development, which is essentially globalization, get foreign direct investment in. We in the West, in the minority world, will just do the services. China and India, the Philippines and Brazil will do the heavy lifting. Now that model of development is now bust. Essentially, if you want to put it in very simple terms, the old model of development was based on the 3 Bs: buildings, banks and boutiques. Buildings and property, and all the property that we had, the property bubble is now gone. Banks in terms of financial services, I mean, all the problems with that. And boutiques then, I mean, debt-based consumerism. Now, that was essentially what was driving economic growth. And the problem that the executive has, and indeed other administrations around the world have, what replaces that model? And really the only one that has any credible chance of winning out is something like a Green New Deal. The retrofitting of our economy to reduce energy, pollution, resources. And yet we're not seeing that with the executive at the moment here in Northern Ireland. They are still in a way caught with a view that there is a tension between, or a conflict between, economic development and environment. Well, there is, if you want to have a particularly orthodox view of economic growth. But if you can reformulate that, there's nothing that's incompatible with conserving our resources and reducing our pollution.
It's interesting, John, when you say it, because I was actually encouraged a little bit when the Assembly Committee that did the climate change inquiry actually paid quite a bit of attention to Green New Deal. I was quite surprised at that.
Yes.
But they seemed to kind of respond to it as something that they would embrace. I think they're waiting for the group to formalize it more. Were you surprised at that, or?
I was pleasantly surprised, and I think it's largely due to the presence of the committee's special advisor, Professor Sue Christie, who was a member, like I am, of the Green New Deal group, this informal collection of business, industry, trade unions, academia, trying to push a greening of the Northern Ireland economy. And so it was welcome to see that there. The problem is, if you look at all the economic statements from the executive, there is barely a mention of the opportunities for greening the Northern Ireland economy. There is some, and don't get me wrong, it isn't absent, but in terms of the scaling up, more attention is paid to tourism and agriculture than is paid to the jobs and the great job potentials and things like retrofitting all our housing stock, our particularly social housing stock. I mean, this is, if you like, the triple win of the Green New Deal type analysis. You can employ thousands of people retrofitting and lagging our housing stock. That's one win. These jobs are not outsourceable to China and the Philippines or whatever. You'd also reduce our CO2 emissions, and of course Northern Ireland is lagging behind the rest of the UK in its CO2 commitments. And then finally you would actually address the issue of fuel poverty. So there's a triple win. Something that any minister worth its salt would want to be there cutting the ribbon for a project such as this, but we're just not seeing the imagination. In fact, I would say the greatest failing of governments around the world, but particularly in Northern Ireland, is a failure of creativity and imagination. They encourage entrepreneurship and innovation and so on. They mouth this, but actually when it comes to their own internal thinking and working, they're still stuck in a very 20th century economic model, which is essentially make, take and throw away. That linear economy is now past. We have to get a more circular, holistic, ecologically sensitive economy.